I'm Catherine McKenzie, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Catherine McKenzie.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. I really appreciate you listening. If you go to hankgarner.com, you can go through all of the archives, more than 300 shows, author interviews with the very best people in publishing today. On the right-hand sidebar, there's places where you can subscribe for just about every platform that you could possibly listen to the show on. Essence, Book 1, Septima, the first volume in the exciting new science fiction series by Nick Breaker. Troy is no longer himself. Kidnapped by aliens infected with the essence of the dead General Tomas, Troy grasps at his only hope of survival. He merges his soul with the alien parasite trying to possess him, leaving him forever changed, and not entirely for the worse. Once plagued by crippling phobias, Troy is now fearless, willing to fight his enemies with his bare hands. But with his new strength also comes a new weakness: women. Tomas was notorious for his insatiable desires, and Troy finds himself constantly resisting temptation, especially the gorgeous, manipulative Alta. Although Alta has convinced the Pyrrhans she's helping them prepare to battle the murderous Reptarans, she's actually meticulously planning to steal their ultimate power source and then abandon them to their fate. Alta won't hesitate to kill anyone in her way, and her deep love for Tomas is Troy's only advantage. He convinces Alta that Tomas has taken full control of his being and thus keeps her trust and his life. While Alta schemes, Troy covertly struggles to save the Pyrrhans and prevent the Reptarans from invading Earth. But first he must wrest back control of his own soul. Essence, Book 1, Septima, the first volume in the exciting new science fiction series by Nick Breaker. Find it on Amazon today. There's a link in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Catherine McKenzie on the show with me. Catherine has a brand new book that when you're listening to this, it comes out the very next day. So I want you all to run out and grab a copy of The Good Liar. It's amazing, and I know you're going to love it. Welcome to the show, Catherine.
Thank you.
Catherine, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, wow, that's a hard one. You know what? I think I actually just always wrote. I don't remember having a first memory of wanting to write. I have a first memory of writing some very, I'm sure, cheesy poem when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old and leaving it for my parents to read, but I guess that's my first memory of writing.
So, were you a bookish kid? Did you read a lot?
I did. Yeah, I was always reading, and, my parents would be like, turn off your light, go to bed.
What sorts of things did you like to read?
As a kid, I think I read all the Roald Dahl books. I loved the Little House on the Prairie books. I read the Anne of Green Gables books. When I was a bit older, I read a lot of Judy Blume. I think I read all those horrible V.C. Andrews books. Before I was a teenager, I'd say that's probably what I was reading.
Gotcha. What did, now, a lot of writers and storytellers, like you said, have just kind of always written, and it's just been something that's part of your nature. And if you have that storytelling gene, it just, one day you just realize that it's switched on and it's what you do. But not all of us pursue that as a career. There are other things to do in life, and like pay bills and, raise families and stuff like that. and you kind of need to, finance that. So what did you decide to do career-wise?
So I'm a lawyer, and I still practice law, actually. I never really thought about being a writer as a profession, to be honest. So it wasn't a choice. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to work for a while and then I'll write. I just, as I said, I think writing was something I did, and it wasn't something that I thought about making a living at. And then that probably changed, 12 years ago, or I had an idea for something, and I wasn't quite sure what it was, and I started writing it, and it eventually turned into the first novel I wrote, which sits in a drawer where it belongs. But I think it was really at the end of that process where I thought, if I write something that's good enough, maybe I should try and get it published.
So what was, you said you have a desk drawer novel like most writers
like
do.
Most people. Yeah.
Right. What was the, so we won't talk about that because, we like to leave.
It's in the drawer for a reason.
Exactly. Those are great learning experiences. But what was the book that did get published, and what was the, well, first off, when you wrote that desk drawer novel, and you realize, okay, this is not the one to go out to the world, what was your motivation for writing that second novel?
Well, I felt like I had sort of learned to, before I wrote the desk drawer novel, or my practice novel, as I call it, I didn't really think I could write a novel. I'd literally only written poetry before then. I hadn't even written short stories. And so it was really a learning process for me. I'm like, okay, I've read thousands of novels. What is a novel? How do you write a novel? And I think when I was writing that desk drawer book, I had an idea for something else that I had a feeling was commercial and sellable. So I think that is what helped me. And what that book was is my book Arranged, which ended up being the second novel of mine that was published, but it was the novel that I got my first agent with. So I guess I was right.
So what was what's the story of that book? What's it about?
So Arranged is about a woman who uses an arranged marriage service. So she's a North American woman, so not somebody who comes from a country where there's tradition of arranged marriages. And she finds a card on the street one day, and she thinks it's a dating service. She's kind of at the end of her rope romantically, and when she goes there and finds out that it's an arranged marriage service, she eventually decides to use the service. And that's the beginning of the story.
Nice. You grew up in Canada, right? And you still live there now?
Yes, I do, yes.
I'm always interested to hear how where we grow up and those early influences, how they affect us as a writer. And a lot of times, the kind of the place that we're from kind of bleeds through in our writing in one way or another. Do you feel like that is the case for you? And do you feel like that being Canadian or from the specific part of Canada that you're from, do you think that's had any sort of effect on the kinds of stories you tell, or maybe the way you tell stories?
Interesting question. I mean, of course, the answer to all those, it always has to be yes, right? But I would think sort of more explicitly in my case that it might have shaped my writing in a way that is less than obvious, in the sense that there is a very strong tradition of literary fiction in Canada, Can Lit as it's called. And, if you think of Margaret Atwood and a bunch of other Margaret Lawrence, or even, what's his name, the guy who wrote the Desert movie, Michael Ondaatje, is Canadian. So there's a strong tradition, Florence Hill, there's a strong tradition, Mordecai Richler, of writing literary fiction in Canada. And it might be the way that's taught in school, but I was never a huge fan as a kid of Canadian literary fiction. And so I think when I was writing, I was actually worried that I would never get published in Canada because I didn't fit into what was being published in Canada. And so I really tried to shape my work more for an American audience from the beginning for that reason. Eventually, ironically, my first book deal was in Canada, and really the last 10 years, Canada has developed its own commercial fiction market and its own crop of Canadian commercial fiction writers. But that was really on the leading edge of that. And so when I started looking for agents or places to submit work, I looked around for other commercial fiction written by Canadians, and there just wasn't any that I found. So I think it's weird. It's sort of almost like a negative of okay, I don't fit into that box, so I better make sure I fit into this other box if I ever want to get published.
Nice. Have the types of stories changed that you have in the books that you've written over the last dozen years or so? I think you said you've been writing. I know the new book, The Good Liar, is a thriller and kind of a psychological thriller. Right. Is that what you started writing? And if not, how do you feel like your writing has evolved, or maybe your place in genres has changed?
It's definitely not what I started writing. I think that the first book, Arranged, that I mentioned, and the next book that I wrote, which is Spin, which was my first book that was published, are much more in the sort of romantic comedy vein. When they came out, I think they were positioned as chick lit. I'm not sure they were really that, but certainly women's fiction, squarely commercial fiction. I always thought, to me, Spin was, I was trying to be the female Nick Hornby, if that situates you in literature. And then I think over the years, for sure, my writing has changed, my stories have changed, I've changed. I'm 10, 15 years older than when I started. And certainly I think probably they've become more serious. I'm not writing comedies anymore, though I hope that there's really some humor in my books. And I think I probably transitioned more through psychological suspense, mystery, and then my last two books have been more thrillers. But I think still always with this element of women's fiction in there. So characters are important to me. So I think that domestic suspense, I guess, is one word that's used for it, but that character-driven thriller, where it's not just about, somebody shooting at a guy who got kidnapped and like, what's the next horrible thing that's going to happen to him, but more the character-driven thriller where the mystery and the suspense comes from the relationships and secrets and how people interact. And I think also for me, I didn't ever set out to write in a specific genre, and I still don't do that now. It's more, what's the story that speaks to me in any given moment? And then what challenges can I confront or give myself as a writer? I don't want to write the same book over and over again. I like to tell different stories. And I'd like to give myself challenges with each book, something that I haven't done before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a writer needs the freedom to evolve, and not just evolve, but to tackle different things. Because I totally agree with you that each book needs to be its own entity. And just like we don't all read the same books all the time, we don't watch the same movies, we don't live two-dimensional lives, I think a writer ought to have the freedom to pursue all of those different veins in his or her writing as well. Do you feel like, I know some people would think that if you start writing, kind of lighter, comedy, romantic comedy, or that sort of thing, and then you wind up, writing thrillers, some people might say,
Sorry, you faded out there. I didn't actually hear the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Do you feel, a lot of people might say, and I do not agree with this, but they might say, she started writing comedy and she's grown as a writer into writing more serious fare. I don't subscribe to that, because like you said, I think the writer ought to have the freedom to write what's on her mind at any given time. But do you feel like that you're, that you've grown as a writer that maybe allows you to tell more intricate stories, now than when you started?
I mean, yes and no. I certainly think that each book that I've written is the best that I could do at that moment, and they each have something that's intrinsically good. And if I went back and tried to rewrite Spin, for example, I'm not sure it would be a better book. I think it came out right because that was the story that I could tell then. But do I have more tools in my writer toolbox? Absolutely. When I first, so Arranged is about this woman who uses an arranged marriage service. And originally, halfway through the book, I was going to switch to the man that she ends up marrying's perspective. And I could not figure out how to do it. I couldn't figure out, how do I tell that story without this whole thing seeming repetitive and losing momentum? And so I didn't write it that way. And I'm not sure it would have been a better book written that way. It would have been a different book. But that was an instance where I just didn't feel like I had the ability as a writer. Whereas now I've written, multiple books with multiple narrators. I know how I would do it now. But again, I think, that would take something away from the story the way it ended up being structured. I do also remember Spin is about a journalist who follows a celebrity into rehab to get the inside scoop. And my original plan for the book was that most of it would not take place in rehab. I think they were supposed to be in rehab for maybe half the book and then leave. But I just couldn't get her out of rehab. Like, I was literally, I don't know how to make her leave. How does this end? I can't do it. And again, I think it's good that she ends up staying and completes the 30-day program, and then they leave in a sort of organic way. But I did feel like a failure as a writer in the moment because I just felt like I did not have control over the book. And I don't tend to feel that way anymore. There are things that happen as I'm writing that might change my plan, but I don't feel like I'm not in control of what's going on.
Well, and one of the pitfalls of hindsight is that when we do acquire more tools, if you go back and start changing things based on what you know now, that the book is not going to be what it is. It's going to turn into something completely different.
Yeah.
And exactly. you have to learn how to walk away from it.
You do, and I was confronted with that in sort of two different ways. One that's kind of funny, but so Spin came out in the UK many years after it came out, first in Canada in 2010, in the US in 2012, and I think in the UK in 2014. So now, at that point, it was like 6 years after I'd written it, and when we were going through the file, I still had to reread it because it had to be converted into British spelling and all that stuff. And I was like, man, I really overused a certain curse word. And so I did like Control Find to find all instances of this word. And I can't even tell you how many there were. So I think I cut 50 because I was like, this, yeah. And you know what? Honestly, I don't think that somebody who read one version or the other, but it just, for me, was like, wow, I really was being lazy here. So I cut them out, but not all the cursing, but she's in rehab. There's going to be cursing, but certainly it was overused. And then I think more substantively, so my last novel, Fractured, is about an author who's written a best-selling novel. Think of Gone Girl and how the life of the writer might be changed after writing a book like that. And I based it on this other novel that I had at the drawer at the time, called The Murder Game, which I had written before it was published and was a legal thriller. And that book almost got published 2 different times. But both times the editors wanted substantive changes that I just couldn't deliver. Like, they had one vision of the book and I had another, and it just didn't work out. And when I went to issue this thing in 2016, I realized, 10 years after I'd written it, what I needed to do. And I was able to go in and cut about 15,000 words, which is basically what needed to happen to make it work better, and get the novel where it needed to be. But I just, that was, I think, probably like the one time in history where I'd say going back actually made it better. But previous to that, I always thought the problem with the editorial that people wanted was that it was taking away from what was good in the novel. And so that was the tension. I called it rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's just like, thing is not working and this is not helping.
Right. You mentioned earlier that you still practice law. How do you juggle those two things? Because I can imagine that's a very demanding career. And writing can be very demanding, not only time wise, but your mental space as well. When you're, working out, plots and characters and things like that, it can be very distracting for the rest of life. How do you balance those two things?
I think I've learned to over the years. Certainly there are times when they are in conflict, and obviously law has to predominate because, those are real people that I have to, I can't let down, and I don't want to let down. I think it's mostly for me creating lots of space around my writing deadlines. So I make sure that I have a schedule where if some emergency happens in my law life, then I still have time to get my writing stuff done. I think, I mostly now write on the weekends, and not that I never work on a weekend as a lawyer, of course I do, but, as you progress through your career, you become, in both sides, you become more efficient, you become hopefully more organized. And so, I usually have the space that I need to on the weekend to write and to think of stories and to get things done. It doesn't always work out as planned, obviously, but, that's, my joke to people is always that I took my fun hobby in writing and turned it into a second job when I did not need a second job. But,
there's so much truth in that. So much truth in that.
Yeah.
Oh man. The new book is with Lake Union Publishing. How long have you been with them?
So this is my fourth book with Lake Union.
How did you come to be connected with them?
So my first three books in the U.S. were published by Harper, and then they did not pick up my fourth novel. So I had to find a new publisher, and Lake Union was really just starting then. So Amazon Publishing had been going on for a couple of years, but they had just started to create, they'd started, I think, first their romance imprint, and then Thomas and Mercer, their mystery thriller imprint. And then I think Lake Union really had just started as their commercial fiction or book club fiction, I think they call it, imprint. And, they were doing different and interesting things with publishing and getting books in front of people. And so I decided to, take them up on their offer and see what they could do. And it's been a great experience for me.
I love what they're doing with their imprints. They are not just in marketing, because you would assume that they would be kind of the 800-pound gorilla in book marketing right now, and they are.
Right.
But they're really producing gorgeous books, and like the hardcover of The Good Liar, your new book, is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it is.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. The dust jacket, of course, is beautiful, but you take that off, and the book itself is printed, and it's got this really cool design on the book itself, which you don't see a lot. Like they're really taking the book product and making it a premium thing again. So I'm really excited about what they're doing. And when I saw that you were published with them, I said, oh, well, this is going to be really interesting. So it's, I really like it. So let's talk about the new book. The Good Liar is your seventh or eighth book, depending on how you count, I think is how you put it.
Well, because I published this other book under a pseudonym, but
gotcha.
So it's my eighth novel, I think. Yeah.
Gotcha. What's the story of this book, and who are the characters that we meet?
So the story of this book is three women who are affected by the same tragedy. There's Cecily, who was supposed to, so the tragedy is a building that explodes as a result of a gas explosion in Chicago. Cecily was supposed to be in the building, and she was late for a meeting with her husband, and so she watches the building fall, knowing that her husband is inside. And a photographer who happens to be there takes a picture of her watching the building and becomes kind of the iconic photograph of the day. You know, if you think back to tragedies, there's always like one or two iconic photographs that get used over and over again. So this is of her. And then there's another character named Franny who lost her birth mother in the tragedy. She had recently reconnected with her, and so you know there's that tragedy for her. And then there's a third woman, Kate, who's actually in Montreal, and you know that she has some connection to the tragedy, but you're not entirely sure what it is. So those are the three characters.
When you first started thinking about this book, which came first to you? Did the characters come first, or did the kind of the plot scenario of this tragedy, which becomes the inciting incident for all of these people? Which came first to you?
Well, I've actually sort of had the ideas for various pieces of this book as separate ideas for a long time. So I would say that the individual storylines probably came to me first. And then it was really when the third storyline came to me that they coalesced into one piece. And I realized that I could tell the story, and it would be a better story telling three pieces. So I'd had the idea of someone who uses a tragedy to run away from their life for years, probably going back to 9/11. And at the time I wasn't writing books, so I didn't really know what the idea was. It was just a thought, I guess. And I had thought about trying to turn that into a book at some point, but felt like spending an entire book with someone who did that might be hard and challenging. And then I heard many stories about people who joined support groups to get close to, even though they didn't suffer from whatever the support group was for. And there's a movie and a book about a woman called The Woman Who Wasn't There, who pretended that she was a victim in 9/11 and became the head of the survivors group before she was exposed. And I just thought that idea of someone who would like run toward a tragedy, I found fascinating. But I didn't know what to do with that idea either. And then I heard another story connected with 9/11 that really sort of coalesced the three ideas to me. So I think it was those ideas, and the concept that I had was, if you thought of the tragedy in the middle of a circle, that there'd be somebody running towards it, somebody running away from it, and somebody being pulled towards it against their will. And so that was kind of the fusion of these ideas. And then it was, okay, how do they work out? And the first thing that came to me was Cecily's voice. And in fact, the thing that is the prologue now, where she sees the building go down. And I actually, this is the only time, luckily, this has happened to me. I wrote another version of that prologue and lost it. Yeah. So I had the imagery in my head. I don't know what the words were. I don't know if they were better than what ended up. But yeah, and I remember when I went to look for it, because I wrote it down and then I had to go write another book. And when I came back to look for it, I was like, where does this go? Why is this not here? And I realized what I'd done, because I deleted some old files and I on another computer and somehow. And anyway, long story, but very frustrated. And thankfully, it was only a couple of pages and not 30 or 40 pages of manuscript. In which case, I might have just walked away. I don't know.
Wow. I definitely I connected with the 9/11. What am I trying to say? The 9/11 kind of spirit of what informed some of the story, I think, because when you're reading the opening of the book, you get those feelings all over again. Like I definitely understood the kind of the emotional resonance that you were going for there. It really kind of hit home. Having such a dramatic experience to open the book with, do you think that is easier to get the story going because so many people will connect emotionally pretty deeply with a tragedy like that?
I think what that gives me as a writer is space to then develop the characters a little bit, because I think if that wasn't there, if you just looked at the next 30 pages of the book, you might be like, what's going on here? So I think that's more what it was. I think it was that, you know, there was this very dramatic event, and then we're a year later, and so, you know, as a reader, okay, I'm going to see what the fallout is from this, and so I'm going to give that a bit of time for the writer to develop the mystery, the suspense around the fallout. I mean, there's other ways one could have gone about it, obviously, but you know, almost all of my books, when I don't start writing, in all of my books, I don't start writing until a voice of at least one of the characters comes to me. And invariably, with maybe one exception, that ends up being the beginning of the book. So I think, you know, and I've learned to sort of go with my instincts as a storyteller about that being the right place to start the story. I like taking people and dropping them in the middle of the story. I think that is, you know, hopefully one of the things I do well, that there's not a lot of like throat clearing, as I call it, at the beginning of novels. You know, it's just, you're just boom, you're in the middle of it. And I think that's how you engage readers, and it's a tool to use to write a page turner.
Yeah, for sure. Are you a plotter, or do you just discover the story as you go?
Or a pantser?
Or a pantser.
I'm definitely much more of a pantser. In the sense that I don't write outlines. I hate writing outlines. I've sometimes been forced to write outlines, and then I never look at them again, and then I go back at the end, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I planned to do. Oh well. Yeah. I personally find that they constrain my creativity, but I do definitely need to know what the end of a book is and what the major twists in a book are, particularly a book like this, before I start writing. So if he's to be believed, you know, Stephen King just like starts writing a book and has no idea where it's going, according to him. You know, so like maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. I have my doubts. But for me, if I can't see the end of the story, then I'll never start writing the story in the first place. I need to know, what am I writing towards? Because it's too messy otherwise. And I need that end moment pulling me. Whether it might change a bit or not, that's happened for sure. But for instance, if you're writing a book about, you know, a whodunit, in one sense or another, you need to know whodunit, I think, when you're writing. You know, you can't sort of decide at the end, because I think that would feel false to the reader. The reveal would be false because it would be so hidden that it would even be hidden from the writer. So I don't think that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just going to feel like a book full of red herrings, and then,
right. Exactly.
Yeah. And you're like, well, I don't think they knew what they were doing either. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
And whereas I wanted people to feel like, oh, and if they go back, they'll be like, oh, that's what that character meant.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. As a reader at the end, you want to be able to live with that book a little bit and think back to all of the places and go, oh, I should have known that but of course you couldn't know it until you have the culmination of the story. But it
shouldn't come as a complete surprise. Like, even if it's a complete surprise in the moment when you read whatever that final reveal is, it shouldn't come out of nowhere, because I don't think that's fair to the writer, exactly. Right? It's like, oh, damn it.
Oh man, I love it. So when you're, and I agree with you about just writing blind versus kind of understanding where you're going. Maybe I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I know where I'm going. When before I begin a book, I usually know the opening, and I usually know the final chapter, or if not the final chapter, the final scene in that chapter. I know where my characters are going. I know what the emotional resolution is going to be. Maybe it's just a feeling. Maybe I know what the character is going to feel like in this time. Therefore, I know what I need to do for them in the meantime.
Right.
When you're dealing with three characters like you are in The Good Liar, what are some of the challenges in in balancing those three stories and making sure. Are you there? Hello, Catherine?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, okay. I'm here.
No, what are the challenges in writing three characters like you have in The Good Liar to make sure that they each get proper representation, but also that you're keeping the story moving forward for all three of them while you're writing?
I mean, definitely one of the major challenges is finding a voice for each character, so that they come off as distinct people. So I think that's definitely a challenge. I think depending on the kind of story you're writing, I've written multiple point of view characters where each character kind of leaves off where the other one started. And so they're moving the story forward in that way. I think in this book more, so the format, just for people who haven't read it yet, is the main character is told in first person in the past tense, or Cecily, who I call the main character. And certainly spend the most time with her in the book. And then Kate is in the third person, and Franny is told in interview transcripts because there's a documentary filmmaker who's making a film about these people. And so I think, the trick for me was to reveal enough information in each segment to move the story along while still keeping the suspense and the mystery, hopefully. So what that meant was that I had to give each of them multiple levels of secret that would be revealed over the course of the book, because it wasn't all driving to one final reveal. Because if it had only been one character who had it, then the other timelines would have seemed like, well, why am I reading about this person? So I think that was certainly one of the challenges for me.
You said that you like to that you need to know your character's voice before starting,
right? And
that really shows in your writing, because the dialogue is what really drives this book. It's really it keeps the story moving forward. Your characters are fully realized in their dialogue, in the way they talk. You really get to understand the characters. Is dialogue something that you pay a lot of attention to, or does it just come out of knowing and understanding those characters before you start writing them?
No, dialogue is very important to me. It's also sort of, I think, one of my fortes as a writer. And I know as a reader, I'm much more drawn to dialogue, and long passages of prose I might start glazing over, even in a book that I really like. So I'm better at this now, but when I first started writing, I'd come out all dialogue, and then I'd have to go back and add in some prose and some movement. What does the room look like that they're in, and what are they wearing, and what's happening, what does it smell like? And I'm actually in the middle of editing my next book, and I still find passages where I'm like, wow, that was like 4 pages of dialogue. I need to fix that. But yeah, I mean, I think realistic dialogue is important, and even more so in this day and age where there's so much great writing on TV, which is all dialogue basically, right? People, that's how they're used to being told stories. And I think that's an effective way of telling a story. But what it means, of course, is that when people speak to each other, the conversation is there for a reason, right? It's not just like, hey, how's it going? Like, it's got to drive the story, whether it's telling you about something about them as a person or whether it's revealing plot. It's in my books, it's always the main engine of the story. Certainly, I would say I'm, probably in the 70%. I've never done the math, but I'd say it's probably 70% dialogue. And certainly the interview transcripts, which was again sort of one of the challenges for myself, was could I convey someone's personality entirely through a transcript, where you don't, even though you do see those characters in other scenes, the real heart of what you see of Franny is in those transcripts. But there's nobody telling you like what the look is on her face, or how she's moving her hands, or her body, or you don't have access to her inner monologue at all. Your entire impression of her is shaped by what she's saying out loud, and that was a challenge to me. in the book.
One of the other challenges in writing a dialogue heavy book is to not use a character for just info dumps.
Yes.
Because that becomes very evident when you see that. You're like, oh, groan.
Yes.
Yes. What are some of the things that you've learned about writing dialogue that lets you sidestep that trap? Because that's a trap a lot of authors fall into, and you navigate it very well.
Thank you. I think first of all, being conscious of that is the number one thing. And I think it's really just always keeping in mind to me that, the reader will catch up. People should speak to each other the way people speak to each other in real life, which actually often is shorthand and does create mystery in and of itself, right? If you think about a conversation you might listen in on in a coffee shop or in a restaurant, you don't know the backstory. These characters are not info dumping to one another, but you could probably figure out pretty quickly what's going on, what's the dynamic, right? Not always, but so I try to think about it like that, as if people are listening in on conversations. And so I think when you do that, then you're able to convey the information without spoon feeding it to the reader or doing an information dump, as you say, and then there are always times when you need to do some kind of information dump. And I think it's actually better served if the character, and there are probably a couple of them in the book where the character is sort of going back and explaining how they got to a place in their head, more in prose. When I teach this topic, one of the examples I give is in the Hunger Games. But there needs to be an explanation of what that is. And instead of having two characters sort of who, of course, know what the Hunger Games is, explain what the Hunger Games is to one another, instead she has this device where, everyone's gathered in the square and they're reminded of what the Hunger Games is, and that's part of the sort of maliciousness of the games itself. Is to be, reminded of why we're doing this every year. And so I think it's actually an info dump, but it's done in a completely organic way in the story. And so I think, that's what I'm trying to do is not have somebody think, now you're just telling me a bunch of stuff. And it is also the principal rule, right? Like show, don't tell.
Well, another great tool, especially for writing thrillers, is that in kind of observing people's conversations and letting the reader pick up clues from that, is that you can also give false information, because a character might be deceiving the other person, or they might not know the whole story. And those can be very great tools for misguiding the reader to, as you're unraveling a mystery.
No, absolutely. Because people do lie to one another.
Exactly.
So then you didn't lie to the reader, right?
The character did.
The character did, and so it does work very well in thrillers for sure.
So the good liar is when people are listening to this, they can go out and grab their copy. It's releasing tomorrow. What do you hope people take away from this book at the end when they get to the end of the story? No spoilers, obviously. But what feeling do you hope they're left with in the end?
Well, I do hope they're surprised by the sort of there's a final reveal in the last page of the book. I do hope they're surprised. I hope that they're satisfied with that reveal, that it makes sense to them. And then, ultimately, I always hope that people are happy they read the book, that it's something that they want their friends and families to read, and that it's a conversation piece. I think one of the challenges when I first thought of this book and was talking about it with various people was how to not be exploitative of 9/11, how to not, and of course writers are just always exploiting situations for their own goods. But I think I read a review on Goodreads the other day that said, this made me think about how people who were in that tragedy's lives were affected. And I hadn't really thought about that before. And I really took that as a compliment, because that is ultimately, one of the things that I wanted to explore with the book is tragedy can reveal the good. It can also reveal the bad in people. And I think we do have a tendency in our society to sort of hagiographize, if that's the word, people who die in mass tragedy events. I think there's a character at one point who says, kind of law of averages, that if 500 people die in a tragedy, at least one of them was an asshole,
Right.
And right. But instead, if you listen to CNN, it's like, oh, they were an amazing father. And not to take away from the tragedy but to use an example, there was how many people from Cantor Fitzgerald died, for instance. I mean, these guys were finance guys, were making tons of money, and probably many of them rarely saw their families. Like, they were not all the best guy, the best father, the best husband. That's just I think a fact, and it's still a tragedy what happened to them. But I think I don't like treating people as perfect. I think everyone has the good and bad sides to them, and I think that sometimes those things get revealed to other people against your choice, and that's what I wanted to explore in the book.
Yeah, and what a great exploration it is. The book is The Good Liar. I absolutely love this book. I know that all of our listeners are going to. Catherine, if people are just learning about you, or maybe just meeting you through this podcast, is there a place online where they can read more about you, maybe connect with you, and get plugged into all your work?
Sure. So there's my website, CatherineMcKenzie.com. Catherine is spelled with a C, and McKenzie is MCK, no A. I'm on Twitter as CE McKenzie1, also on Instagram, the same name, and of course I'm on Facebook as well. I think my author page is Facebook, Catherine McKenzie Author. And people can email me or message me, and I do actually love to connect with readers. It's one of the great things about being a writer these days, a sort of instant feedback. People finish your book and they post about it 2 seconds later. Only slightly less nerve-wracking sometimes than sitting there watching somebody read your book. Sometimes I feel like I am. They're like updating their status on Goodreads, but I'm pretty not prevalent, but I'm there. I have a presence online, and I'm certainly accessible if people want to reach out.
Excellent. Catherine, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The year was 1834. The month was December. I was 14. Irving's tale was by then well known. The characters of Brom Bones and the beauteous Katrina were widely understood in town to refer to my parents. Rumors persisted. I heard the name of Headless Horseman whispered. My father dismissed all these tales, calling them malicious. Yet more than once I saw him and my mother scanning Agatha's face across the supper table, finding only a secret smile and a look of defiance. I found the rumors fascinating. I followed Agatha like a pup, waiting for her to cast some magic spell. And one day she did. The household servants had set a fire in the hearth for her comfort, and she sat close to it, counting out small gold coins upon a lap board. I hid in the shadows, hoping she might drop a coin and I could retrieve it for myself. One of her servants, a West Indian girl, carried a snowy log into the room and set it on the fire. It began to hiss and pop, the snow melted, and the fire sputtered out. Agatha cursed as I had never heard her do before. She stood, spilling all the gold, and slapped the idiot girl across the face. The girl ran, and my grandmother muttered to herself, searching for match and tong to no avail. When she was not looking, I crept forward and took for myself one of the gold pieces. Then something remarkable occurred. My grandmother sighed, knelt before the fireplace, reached for the logs, and her right hand caught a fire. Flame blossomed and coiled about her wrist. I gasped and cried out, "Shh! Don't be afraid, my Dylan." "Your hand! She raised her palm. Flame sat cupped in it, casting the shadow of her fingers upon the ceiling and walls.
"Lock the door,"
she said. I obeyed. She pointed to the floor, and I sat, waiting breathlessly.
"This is the Van Brunt gift. It will be your gift as well, soon, and your children's forever afterwards."
"Why does it not burn you?" I asked.
"Why should it? Do I deserve to be burned?"
"No."
"Then I am safe from the fire. Do you deserve to be burned, my Dylan?"
I shook my head.
"Show me."
I reached for the flame and took it. I pulled back at once, crying out with pain, wagging my fingertips. The fire caught my sleeve. I could not rid myself of it, as if I clutched burning tar. The pain intensified. The blisters broke, and a rivulet of lymph ran down my arm.
"Your conscience knows, Dylan. You deserved to be burned. Say it."
"I deserved to be burned," said I.
"Again."
"I deserved to be burned." She turned her palm.
"The gold piece."
I nodded and brought the stolen coin from my pocket. She took it and raised it to the light.
"You cannot wield the flame with guilt in your heart, son. Try, and it will devour you. Do you understand?"
I nodded.
"A Van Brunt should not be so weak."
"I'm sorry I took the gold, Grandmother. I'm sorry I was bad. Don't be ashamed of me." She frowned and laid the gold coin on her lapboard. She shook her head sadly.
"I'm not ashamed that you took the gold. I'm ashamed that you felt the guilt.